Welcome back to AI for the Humanities. I'm Megan McInnes Dominguez, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Delaware, and this is episode 58 of your go-to resource for exploring the intersection of generative AI and humanities education. Whether you're a seasoned experimenter or still figuring out whether any of this belongs in your classroom, you've come to the right place. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the news, covering everything that happened in AI from February 9th through March 29th, 2026, that you as a humanist actually need to know about. And there's a lot. During this period, we got a cascade of major model releases from every major company, a White House policy framework that upends the regulatory landscape, a series of copyright rulings with direct consequences for authors and scholars, and research on AI bias that should call the attention of every humanities educator. We'll also be talking about Google's viral AI image model, its new music generation tool, and what all of it means for the questions we ask in our courses about creativity, authorship, and what it means to make something. I also want to flag a story that barely made headlines outside of the tech press, but deserves far more attention in higher education. The Trump administration's decision to declare Anthropic, the makers of Claude, a national security supply chain risk, and direct all federal agencies to phase out its use. The reasons behind that decision are entirely a humanities story. We'll get to it shortly. Let's get into it. If you felt like AI model releases were already coming fast, the period between February 5th and March 17th will recalibrate your sense of speed. Major models from 5 companies dropped within 6 weeks. Google's Gemini 3.1 Pro topped 13 of 16 major benchmarks, including 94.3 on an expert-level scientific knowledge test, a result that raises a pointed question for any humanities faculty. If a model scores near perfectly on an expert-level knowledge test, degrees must be certifying something else. That something else is closer to Aristotle's phronesis, practical wisdom developed under conditions of real consequence. And the challenge is making it legible before someone else defines it more narrowly. xAI's Grok 4.20, also released during this period with architecture worth noting, it hardwires a fact-checking agent as a discrete module separate from a creative reasoning agent, encoding the assumption that facts and interpretations are cleanly separable, an assumption that does not survive contact with the humanities. And China's DeepSeek is preparing version 4, timed to its national parliamentary meetings, a reminder that AI systems encode the assumptions and political constraints of their developers. The Dartmouth study later in this episode develops exactly what that means in practice. Here I want to focus on 4 releases with more direct implications for the classroom. Anthropic released Claude Opus 4.6 on February 5th, 2026. According to TechCrunch, Opus 4.6 introduces a new feature called Agent Teams, which Anthropic's head of product, Scott White, described as comparable to having a talented team of humans working for you, with segmented responsibilities that allow agents to coordinate in parallel. The model also expands the context window to 1 million tokens in beta, meaning it can hold approximately 2,000 pages of text in a single session, and it integrates Claude directly into PowerPoint as an accessible side panel. Anthropic's own announcement notes that Opus 4.6 leads all other frontier models on Humanities' Last Exam, a complex multidisciplinary reasoning test. 12 days later, on February 17th, Anthropic released Claude Sonnet 4.6 at a substantially lower price point, but with near Opus level performance on most tasks. CNBC reported that Anthropic simultaneously closed a $30 billion funding round at $380 billion post-money valuation. But the more important story is buried in the same period. According to Wikipedia's continuously updated Claude entry, in late February 2026, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth threatened to cut Anthropic from the Department of Defense's supply chain unless Anthropic permitted unrestricted use of Claude for domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons. Anthropic refused. On February 27th, Hegseth declared Anthropic a supply chain risk, and Trump directed every federal agency to phase out Claude within 6 months. Anthropic announced that it would challenge the designation in court. The Anthropic DoD confrontation is significant, not just for its content, but for its structure. A private corporation refused a government demand on ethical grounds, and the government responded by reframing principled refusal as disloyalty. That is a pattern with a long history in political philosophy, from Thoreau's civil disobedience to Milgram's obedience studies to contemporary debates about whistleblowing. Students encounter it abstractly in ethics and political theory, but here it's live and institutional. The harder question is this: Anthropic is not a democratic institution. Its ethical commitments were not voted on. The prohibitions that it's defending against reflect the values of a small group of founders, and the fact that those values align with civil liberties norms, in this instance, is essentially a coincidence of personnel rather than a feature of design. If private corporations are the primary site where AI ethics is defended against state outreach, we have substituted fiduciary responsibility for democratic accountability. That is not a stable arrangement. The Anthropic case is ultimately an argument for the democratic AI oversight institutions that do not yet exist. A federal agency with civil society representation, occupational licensing for high-risk AI applications, the international treaty obligations. Imagining those institutions is not idealism. It's the kind of political design work that courses in democratic theory and public policy should be preparing students to do. OpenAI launched GPT 5.3 Codex on February 5, 2026, the same day as Anthropic's Opus 4.6, a coincidence that was not coincidental. Then, on March 5th, OpenAI released GPT 5.4, which TechCrunch describes as its most capable and efficient frontier model for professional work. GPT 5.4 consolidates the coding strengths of 5.3 Codex with improved reasoning and a new computer use API that allows the model to navigate desktops, browsers, and software autonomously. According to OpenAI's own announcement, GPT 5.4 matches or exceeds industry professionals in 83% of knowledge work comparisons across 44 occupations and is 33% less likely to make factual errors than its predecessor. On March 17th, OpenAI followed with GPT 5.4 Mini and GPT 5.4 Nano, its fastest and cheapest variants, available at dramatically lower cost and designed for high-volume subtasks. The three-tier family represents a deliberate access strategy: flagship performance for enterprise, mid-tier for paid subscribers, and stripped-down versions for free users. The competitive dynamics behind these releases matter as much as the models themselves. When OpenAI and Anthropic both launched flagship models on the same day, that is not synchronicity. It's the logic of a technology arms race playing out in real time. Competitive necessity has become the de facto ethics of AI development, and the history of technology governance offers almost no examples of commons problems resolved without external intervention. Antitrust enforcement, nuclear non-proliferation, and environmental regulation each required mandatory constraints that no single actor could impose alone. The Treaty of Tlatelolco, the Montreal Protocol, and the Basel Convention are all cases of international coordination, overriding competitive pressures precisely because individual actors lack the power to act unilaterally. For courses in the history of technology, asking students what the analogous form might look like for AI and why it's not yet emerged is one of the more generative questions available right now. The GD-Val claim deserves specific scrutiny. When OpenAI says that GPT 5.4 matches professionals in 83% of knowledge work comparisons, it's measuring the production of well-specified outputs: sales presentations, legal briefs, financial models evaluated against defined criteria. What it cannot measure is the work that happens before the output is well specified, the judgment about which cases to take, which questions to ask, which constraints are being overlooked. That preliminary interpretive work is what lawyers call professional judgment and what humanists call close reading. The GDV-PAL does not test it. The 83% figure is real and significant, but it describes the ceiling on what AI displaces, not the whole of professional knowledge work. The tiered access structure is the feature most likely to compound educational inequality over time. The flagship GPT 5.4 makes 33% fewer factual errors than the Nano model. That gap is not cosmetic. It's a structural quality difference built into the infrastructure. With students at community colleges and under-resourced institutions systematically receiving less accurate AI assistance than their peers at well-funded research universities. The technologies that were supposed to democratize knowledge are being tiered in ways that precisely lack existing or track existing socioeconomic stratification. For humanities faculty developing AI policies, treating AI access as a neutral background condition is already a mistake. The differential is real, and it belongs in the conversation. On February 26, 2026, Google launched Nano Banana 2, the latest version of its widely popular AI image generation model. TechCrunch reported that Nano Banana 2, technically Gemini 3.1 Flash image, combines the speed of the Flash model with the high-fidelity output of its predecessor, Nano Banana Pro. The model can generate images at resolutions from 512 pixels to 4K, maintain character consistency for up to 5 characters across edits, and follow precise natural language instructions. The name itself has an unusual origin. According to Google's blog, it came from the nicknames of product manager Reina Raisinghani, who submitted the model anonymously to an AI benchmarking platform where it went viral. Google's announcement that all Nano Banana outputs are embedded with SynthID watermarking and are interoperable with the C2PA content credentials, which is a cross-industry provenance standard. The question Nano Banana 2 raises most urgently for visual art education is not about authorship, but about apprenticeship. Learning to draw is not primarily about producing images. It's about learning to see. The sustained attention required to render a face or landscape accurately develops observational skills that transfer broadly. The capacity to notice detail, to hold formal complexity, to understand how visual choices produce meaning. When image generation becomes instant and free, the concern is not that students will stop making images. They will make more of them, but that they will never develop the embodied perceptual practice that drawing and painting produce. Art history faculty who rely on students having some experiential understanding craft of the difficulty of perspective, of how Velázquez mixed color, will increasingly be teaching students who have none, because the tool removed the need to struggle through it. The SynthID watermark and the C2PA credentials are genuine attempts to address the visual trust problem, and they deserve recognition for that. But they address the wrong level of the problem. Watermarks answer the question, was this AI generated? They do not answer the question, is this being used to deceive? An AI-generated image without clear watermark can still be propaganda, labeled deepfake that can still cause harm. For visual rhetoric and media ethics courses, the more productive analytical exercise is to separate these two problems and ask which is more dangerous, in which contexts, and what different kinds of intervention each one requires. The answer to the first problem is technical. The answer to the second is institutional, educational, and cultural, which is to say, it's a humanities problem. On February 18th, 2026, Google DeepMind launched Lyria 3 in beta through the Gemini app, bringing AI music generation to mainstream consumer audiences. According to TechCrunch, users can describe a song in natural language or upload a photo or video, and Lyria 3 generates a 30-second high-fidelity track complete with instrumentals, vocals, auto-generated lyrics, and custom cover art produced by Nano Banana. The model supports prompts in 8 languages, including Spanish, French, Hindi, and Japanese, and spawns genres from punk and jazz to funk, Motown, and classical. Google has positioned Lyria 3 explicitly as a tool for original expression, not mimicking existing artists, with Synth ID audio watermarking throughout and expanded access to YouTube creators through DreamTrack. The 30-second format is a cultural claim, not a technical constraint. 30 seconds is the unit of the attention economy, the length of a reel, a short, a TikTok clip. Musical forms have always been inseparable from the social functions they serve. The Lutheran chorale for collective worship, the spiritual for communal sustenance under oppression, the protest song for the march. A model optimized to generate 30-second tracks for a social media platform is encoding a theory of what music is for. And that theory is a significant departure from most of the world's musical traditions. Music ethnomusicology and world music courses can use this framing to examine not just what Lyria 3 produces, but what it cannot imagine producing. The raga that requires a lifetime to master, the blues that requires a life to have lived, and the call and response that exists only in the room where it happens. For world language faculty, the multilingual capability opens an assignment that is almost irresistible. Generate a song in the target language about a culturally specific topic, a corrido about a historical figure, a fado about the saudade, a devotional form with specific religious conventions, and analyze the output critically. Does the model understand the genre's formal convention? Does the Spanish have regional inflection, or does it sound like translated English? Does it know that fado is rooted in specific Portuguese relationship to longing and loss? Or does it produce something generically melancholic? The gap between what the model produces and what the form actually requires is itself a precise and teachable object of cultural analysis. I should also note, for those of us who produce our own AI music for our own teaching, as I do with Suno for this channel, that Lyria 3 is now a serious competitor worth evaluating, particularly for its multilingual range. On March 20th, 2026, the White House released its National AI Policy Framework, a legislative blueprint directed at Congress outlining 7 guiding principles for AI regulation. According to NBC News and CNBC, the framework calls for a unified federal approach to AI governance, while explicitly seeking to preempt state-level AI laws that the administration characterizes as unduly burdensome. The 7 pillars include protecting children, respecting intellectual property rights, preventing censorship, educating Americans on AI, and enabling innovation to maintain U.S. dominance in the AI race. The framework recommends against creating any new federal rulemaking body for AI, favoring a sector-specific approach with existing agencies. It also seeks to limit legal liability for AI developers. According to NBC News, more than 50 Republicans wrote to the president in early March objecting to pressure on states not to regulate AI, and AI watchdog Americans for Responsible Innovation called the framework one that shields AI developers from liability. The White House framework rewards the same close reading strategy we use on any politically charged document. Examine the internal tensions, not just the stated goals. The framework calls for respecting intellectual property rights while limiting developer liability for copyright infringement. It calls for preventing censorship while seeking to preempt state laws specifically designed to require AI transparency and accountability. It calls for educating Americans on AI while removing the regulatory tools that would give educational institutions any leverage over how AI is deployed in those institutions. These contradictions are not oversights, they're the document's substance. Identifying them is exactly the kind of analytical work a rhetoric or political philosophy course should be doing. What gets foreclosed here matters beyond the immediacy of the policy fight. State-level regulation is historically how the U.S. develops the regulatory knowledge that eventually produces intelligent federal standards. Food safety, child labor laws, environmental protection, all follow that pattern. Colorado, California, and Utah have been doing that work on AI, responding to constituent concerns about algorithmic discrimination, deepfake harms, and transparency. The framework calls their efforts patchwork. Preempting them does not replace them with something better. It eliminates the democratic learning process before it can generate the knowledge federal legislation would need. On March 13, 2026, the EU Council agreed to its position on a proposal to streamline certain provisions of the EU AI Act as part of the Omnibus 7 legislative package. The proposal adjusts the timeline for applying rules on high-risk AI systems by up to 16 months, extends regulatory exemptions to small and mid-cap companies, and reinforces the powers of the EU AI Office. The Council's mandate also adds a new prohibition on AI practices that generate non-consensual sexual and intimate content, including child sexual abuse material. The EU-US regulatory divergence that became explicit this week is not just a policy difference, it's an emerging architectural choice about what the world's AI infrastructure will be accountable to. The EU's approach is rooted in a tradition of treating rights as constraints on markets rather than products of them, a tradition shaped partly by the 20th century experience of states that use surveillance, categorization, and algorithmic sorting of populations with devastating effect. That history is not background. It's the reason the AI Act exists. Understanding why the EU regulates as it does requires the kind of historical and cultural analysis that European studies and modern history courses are equipped to provide. What makes this regulatory divergence consequential over time is what scholars of global governments call the Brussels effect. EU standards tend to become the de facto global standards because companies find it more efficient to comply with the strictest regime than to maintain separate products for different markets. GDPR is the clearest precedent. If the EU AI Act follows that trajectory, European democratic values about human dignity and accountability could become the effective global standard for AI, not through political decision, but through market logic. Courses in comparative politics and global governance can ask whether that outcome is desirable and what leverage smaller political entities have when they cannot design technologies themselves, but can set the conditions under which these technologies operate. Now we move on to issues of copyright. On March 2, 2026, the Supreme Court denied certiorari in Thaler versus Perlmutter, confirming that material must still have human authorship to be eligible for copyright protection. The case involved computer scientist Stephen Thaler's attempts to register AI-generated artwork, which the Copyright Office and lower courts had repeatedly rejected. The Supreme Court's refusal to hear the case definitively closes this avenue for now. The Authors Guild is reminding authors that the March 30, 2026 deadline to file claims in the Bartz versus Anthropic settlement is approaching. The $1.5 billion settlement, which Norton Rose Fulbright identifies as the largest known copyright settlement in AI history, resolves a class action lawsuit in which a group of authors alleged that Anthropic illegally used their books to train its models. The court ruled that AI training on copyrighted books constitutes fair use, but that storing pirated copies of those books does not. Authors whose books appear on the settlement's works list can receive approximately $3,000 per work. Moving on, Encyclopedia Britannica and Merriam-Webster filed a copyright lawsuit against OpenAI on March 17, 2026. According to Fortune, the publishers claim OpenAI used nearly 100,000 copyrighted articles to train ChatGPT, and the chatbot now absorbs and reproduces their fact-checked content in direct responses to users, bypassing their websites and starving them of the traffic and advertising revenue that they depend on. The complaint describes a potential feedback loop in which declining revenues leads to lower quality content, which reduces revenue further. In other news, on March 9, 2026, a New York federal court granted the plaintiff's motion to compel and ordered OpenAI to produce evidence related to its outputs in the multi-district copyright litigation that includes the New York Times and the Authors Guild. The court had previously ordered OpenAI to produce all 20 million output logs on January 5, 2026. In other news, the McCool-Smith AI litigation tracker reports that Disney, Universal Studios, and Warner Brothers have filed suit against AI companies offering video and generation services, alleging infringement of copyrighted franchise or characters. This case adds the major film studios to the growing roster of copyright plaintiffs alongside publishers, musicians, visual artists, and news organizations. Two studies published this period give concrete form to something humanities educators have been arguing by intuition. A Yale study in PNAS Nexus found that AI chatbots shape users' political opinions through biases embedded in default outputs. No explicit political instruction needed. Researchers tested AI summaries of two contested historical events, the 1919 Seattle General Strike and the 1968 Third World Liberation Front student protests, and found that the AI moved readers toward a liberal framing without any prompting. Meanwhile, MIT researchers published a method for identifying hidden conceptual representations inside language models, testing more than 500 concepts, including conspiracy theorist, medieval historian, and social influencer. Among their demonstrations, enhancing a conspiracy theorist representation caused a model to generate a conspiracy-tinged explanation of a famous photograph with no relevant user prompt at all. These two studies point at the same phenomenon from different perspectives. Yale shows that AI outputs carry ideological framings when no framing is intended, not because AI is malicious, but because all summaries encode a perspective, and AI presents its perspective as neutral and default. This was always true of textbooks, encyclopedias, and Wikipedia. AI just makes the question newly unavoidable. The MIT research explains the structural reason. Those biases are not on the surface of outputs. They're embodied as latent representations inside the models themselves. The medieval historian and conspiracy theorist concepts that MIT found are maps of how those ways of thinking exist in the textual culture that trained the system. Together, the two studies open a research agenda that humanists are better equipped to pursue than anyone in computer science: the interpretive and historical work of understanding what a cultural record contains, whose voices dominate it, and what it makes a model capable of thinking. Digital humanities programs should be teaching interpretability methods alongside corpus analysis. What is inside this model is, at root, a humanities question. Researchers at Dartmouth's program in quantitative social science published a study in Harvard's Kennedy School Misinformation Review, examining whether AI models created by companies in different countries exhibit different national biases. The studies audited DeepSeek, Francis Mistral, and US-based GPT-4 and Grok. Key findings include that DeepSeek raises Xi Jinping higher relative to other models, especially when prompted in simplified Chinese, and that both DeepSeek and Mistral censor negative misinformation about their respective national leaders through deliberate guardrails. The study also found that models more readily agree with positively framed misinformation about leaders they favor. The study's methodological contribution deserves as much attention as its findings. The researchers probed model behavior by prompting the same model with the same questions in different languages and comparing the outputs. That approach is a form of contrastive analysis that any faculty member can replicate without technological expertise in machine learning. It requires exactly the comparative method that humanists use when analyzing translations, examining how the same historical event has been narrated across national traditions, or tracing how the same text is received differently in different cultural contexts. The insight that the language you use to query a model is not neutral, that it activates different guardrails, different training emphases, different epistemic environments. It's one that world language faculty are especially equipped to teach. World language pedagogy has been making this argument for decades, that language is not a transparent vehicle for thought, but a structure that shapes what can be said and what gets silenced. The Dartmouth study makes that insight empirically testable. The same AI tool behaves differently in different languages. And analyzing those differences is an act of both linguistic and political literacy. World language departments that build contrastive AI analysis into their curricula are not adding a trend. They're responding to a newly urgent need to prepare students who understand their information environment changes when their linguistic frame changes. The World Economic Forum published an analysis in March 2026 placing misinformation and disinformation among the top short-term global risks, noting that deepfakes have now crossed the threshold where they're accessible to anyone with a smartphone and no longer display the visual artifacts that once allowed detection. The WEF report notes that in Ireland's 2025 presidential election, a deepfake video falsely depicted the eventual winner withdrawing his candidacy, and that the Netherlands saw roughly 400 AI-generated synthetic images used to attack political candidates. The EU AI Act's Article 50, enforceable from August 2026, will require labeling of AI-generated and deepfake content with fines of up to 6% of global revenue for violations. The Ireland deepfake case points to a threat that is more fundamental than the spread of false information: the degradation of testimonial trust. Most of what we know about the world, we know through testimony. Someone told us, or showed us, or we read it. Testimonial trust is not naivete. It's the cognitive infrastructure that makes communication possible at all. Deepfakes, by making it plausible that any video, audio recording, or photograph could be fabricated, attack that infrastructure at its root. The Ireland fake did not even need to convince anyone. It only needed to introduce enough uncertainty to suppress voter confidence. The deepfake is effective even when it fails, because what it produces is not false belief, but epistemic paralysis. The humanities have a precise intellectual tradition for this problem, and it's not primarily about media detection. It's about the conditions under which testimony deserves trust and the institutions responsible for maintaining those conditions. Legal philosophy, philosophy of testimony, and democratic theory all have frameworks for this. The Finnish model, teaching media literacy and source evaluation to children as a foundational civic skill, is not a technical solution, it's a humanistic one. The question is what it would take for American education to treat epistemic resilience as a fundamental civic skill, the way Finland does. What institutions, curricula, and political will that require? The humanities already have the curriculum. The obstacle is not content, it's priority. A Human Artistry campaign poll released on March 6, 2026, found that 92% of Americans support stricter laws preventing AI from using someone's voice, image, or likeness without consent. By a 68 to 22% margin, respondents rejected the argument that AI systems are too complex to compensate creators. 2/3 support requiring AI companies to enter market-based licensing agreements comparable to those that govern streaming platforms. 56% rejected the argument that protecting creator rights would allow China to surpass the United States in AI development. The 92% consensus is a political resource that is currently unorganized. Understanding why popular majorities so consistently fail to produce policy is one of the most studied questions in American political science, and the answer consistently involves the same structural logic. Concentrated economic interests with strong lobbying capacity defeat diffuse public majorities when the issue is sufficiently technical and distant from daily life. The AI creator right issue is every feature that typically produces this outcome. The practical question is organizational. What form of collective action would actually translate this consensus into policy? Labor history and American studies courses have the analytical tools for this question. The streaming of the licensing model, the collective bargaining frameworks developed by WGA and SAG-AFTRA, the guild structures that have historically protected creative workers. These are precedents worth studying, not as curiosities, but as potential templates. The specific finding that 56% of Americans rejected the "let China win" argument is also worth noting as a teachable rhetorical moment. That argument, that protecting creator rights would handicap the US in geopolitical competition is a version of a move that students in rhetoric courses can trace across decades, invoking an external threat to disable domestic accountability. Environmental regulation would handicap American industry. Labor protections would drive jobs offshore. Antitrust enforcement would harm competitiveness. Each time, the geopolitical framing is designed to make accountability feel unpatriotic. The fact that a majority of Americans rejected it in this context suggests either that the tactic is losing effectiveness or that the public is becoming more sophisticated at recognizing it. Either possibility is worth examining. A study published in Inside Higher Ed on February 13th analyzed 31,692 publicly available course syllabi from a large Texas public university over 5 years. Education scholar Igor Chirikov of UC Berkeley found that highly restrictive AI policies introduced after ChatGPT's launch in 2022 have eased across nearly all disciplines, except the arts and humanities, where significant restrictions still remain. Academic integrity concerns fell from 63% of course materials in spring 2023 to 49% by autumn 2025, while attribution requirements rose sharply. A meaningful subset of instructors moved in the opposite direction, actively integrating AI into exams and assessments. The Chirikov data captures a real and defensible instinct. If writing is a practice through which thinking becomes visible, to the writer as much as to the reader, then AI that produces the product without the process is a substitution, not an improvement. The OECD's 2026 Digital Education Outlook supports this concern, finding that AI can boost short-term performance while undermining genuine learning. Faculty who restrict AI in writing-intensive courses are not being technophobic. They're making a principled argument about what their courses are for. But restriction is not the only principled response. Another approach treats AI as one of more authored text to engage with critically, integrated at specific points in an iterative writing process, documented in meta-reflection, and consistently compared to human interpretation and class activities. On this view, the student who must explain why they accepted or rejected an AI-generated paragraph is doing exactly what humanities courses train: source evaluation, critical analysis, accountability for interpretive choices. Both approaches have genuine pedagogical rationale, and the right choice depends on the course, the assignment, and the instructor's goals. Neither should be dismissed. What is not defensible is pretending AI does not exist. Students are using these tools whether or not syllabi address them. Faculty who say nothing leave students without a framework for thinking critically about AI outputs, cede the conversation to disciplines less equipped to have it, and miss the opportunity to do what humanists do best: ask hard questions about who built something, what it encodes, and what it cannot see. The humanities have more to contribute to AI literacy than any other field in the university. Opting out is not neutrality, it's an abdication. Anthropic published a study in early March introducing a new measure of AI labor displacement risk based on actual observed usage patterns. Key findings include that workers most exposed to AI displacement tend to be older, female, more educated, and higher paid, and that hiring of young workers has slowed in exposed occupations. A parallel Harvard Business School study published in Harvard Business Review found that AI has reduced job postings by 17% in the most automated exposed roles, while augmentation-oriented roles have grown by 22%. Both studies note that significant unemployment effects have not yet materialized, but structural changes in hiring are already visible. The demographic profile of AI-exposed workers, older, female, more educated, higher paid, has a structural logic that deserves naming directly. Many of the occupations most exposed are fields that are open to women during the 20th century, when professional knowledge work became accessible beyond the traditional male elite. Paralegal work, research assistants, editing, administrative analysis, non-tenure track teaching. These are fields with high proportions of women. And they're also fields that Anthropic data intensifies as most at risk. AI automation is not a neutral technological process. Its costs are being distributed along familiar lines of gender and institutional vulnerability, which means it's reproducing and accelerating existing inequalities, even as its benefits are presented as universal. Who defines irreplaceable is not a neutral question. The capabilities that the post-AI knowledge economy rewards will be defined in part by whoever has the power to define them. If humanities faculty do not participate actively in that definition, making explicit what their students can do and what AI cannot, contributing to assessment frameworks and hiring rubrics that reflect those capabilities, someone else will define it. The Anthropic and Harvard studies give us the data to make that argument. The question is whether we will. An NPR report published on March 3rd found that more than 3 years after ChatGPT's launch, professors and students are still working out how and whether to use it, particularly in humanities courses. An Inside Higher Ed and Generation Lab poll found that approximately 85% of undergraduates are using AI for coursework. One recent graduate told NPR that she stopped using AI because it made her feel like she was outsourcing her thinking, and that felt really weird. One professor who spent a sabbatical studying AI concluded, it seems to be one of the main purposes of the tools is to keep you from having to think so hard. That student's phrase, outsourcing my thinking, points toward what cognitive scientists call desirable difficulties, the finding that conditions that make learning harder in the short term produce better retention, transfer, and deep understanding over time. AI assistants can systematically eliminate those difficulties, filling in gaps before the learner has to grapple with them, resolving ambiguity before they have to sit with it. The student who stopped using AI was not anti-technology. She was responding to a real cognitive cost. That cost is real, and faculty who design courses around protecting the struggle are making a legitimate pedagogical argument. But the opposite case is equally serious. Students will use AI in their professional lives. In many cases, they already are. If they graduate without frameworks for using it critically and reflectively, we've not protected their thinking. We've just left them without tools for the environment that they're entering. Faculty who are genuinely interested in AI need to learn how to teach it, not just permit or prohibit it. The most promising approaches share one feature. They make AI use as a reflective act rather than a passive one. A student required to document how they used AI, where it helped, where it failed them, what they decided to do differently is doing metacognitive work, noticing and analyzing their own thinking in real time. Metacognition has always been a goal of humanities education, but largely implicit. Making it an explicit objective with AI as the occasion for developing it may be one of the most productive things a humanities course can do right now. The student who can articulate exactly why she stopped using AI had already begun to develop it. The student who uses AI thoughtfully and can explain every choice has developed something equally valuable. Both outcomes require teaching. Neither happens by accident. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the fastest model release cycle in US history to a constitutional confrontation between private AI companies and the US government, from viral image generators to lawsuits that could reshape how human knowledge is valued in the digital economy. What I keep returning to across all of these stories is the question of what it means to take responsibility. Anthropic took responsibility when it refused to remove prohibitions on surveillance and autonomous weapons, even at a significant cost. Dictionaries took responsibility when they argued in court that researchers and editors deserve credit or compensation for the knowledge they built. Faculty are taking responsibility when they make careful, considered distinctions between where AI assists and where it replaces. Students are taking responsibility when they notice what AI does to their thinking and make conscious choices about when to use it. That's the work that we do in the humanities. We teach people to take responsibility for how they read, how they argue, and how they make meaning in a complicated world. AI is now part of that world. Our job is not to welcome it uncritically or reject it wholesale. It is to help students understand it well enough to make principled choices and to make sure the conversations that shape AI's future include humanistic values at the table. Thank you for joining me for this episode of AI for the Humanities. If you found it useful, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Share it with a colleague who's figuring out this along with you. I will see you next time.
Seven bottles dropped in February. Every week a new machine. Claude and Gemini racing each other for a crown that nobody's seen. Opus builds a team of agents and 1 million tokens wide. But Anthropic drew a line in the sand, and the DOD did not like that ride. They said use it for surveillance. They said use it for the war. And Anthropic said no. Now the federal agencies show them the door. It's the weekend machines. It's the age of the unseen. Who decided what the model learned? Whose voice is in the scenes? Nano banana paints the picture. Lyria sings the song. But who gets credit? Who gets paid for all the work alone? Every tool that we invent carries what we chose to say. Somebody wrote the training set, somebody looked the other way. Every bias in the output is a human choice upstream. The humanities aren't the problem, we're the ones who know what words mean. Britannica took OpenAI to court, Mary and Webster right behind. Said you built $1 billion product on the work of human minds. Deepfakes training in Beijing whispers different things in Chinese. The model holds a loyalty you can't always see or seize. The court said you can't hold the copyright if no human touched the pen. But the question that nobody answered is who built the world it learned from. It's the weekend machines. It's the age of the unseen. Who decided what the model learned? Whose voice is in the scenes? Nano banana paints the picture. Lyria sings the song. But who gets credit? Who gets paid for all the work alone? White House said we're winning the race. Brussels said not so fast. One says innovation first, one asked how long can damage last. Faculty held the line on writing. Students felt their thinking thin. When the output beats the process, where does education begin? Yale said the default summary moves your politics without a word. MIT said the conspiracy theorist lives inside the model, waiting to be heard. The OECD said AI boosts your score, but the learning disappears. And 92% of Americans said pay the artists, they've been waiting years. It's the weekend machine. It's the age of the unseen. Who decided what the model learned? Whose voice is in the scenes? We're the ones who ask the questions. We're the ones who hold the thread. The humanities aren't competing. We're the reason it's not dead. who writes the history, who frames the frame, who teaches the machine to say whose name. Not the model, not the prompt, not the benchmark on the screen. The one who asks the question is the one who shapes the dream.